actually, he's now said he's finished writing the pilot for a rebooted, AKA also known as Reimagined Babylon 5. The timeline is that he turns in the script by the end of the year, and he actually has turned it in, got what he says are very sensible notes, and he's returned it in. They look to get the, okay, so by the end of the year, he's got it turned in already. In January, and I think he said by around the second week of January, he should get a decision on whether to greenlight the pilot, and then they will shoot it in the spring and hopefully air in the fall. Now, the way it works these days is not the way it was back in the day. In fact, when the original P5 came out, they did the pilot, they showed it, and then they dilly-dallied for a year before they decided to greenlight the show. From what Joe says online these days, that's not the way they do it anymore. That once they see the filmed pilot, they will make the decision of whether to go greenlight the series. So,
and he's up all night tweeting on Twitter,
yeah,
talking to people.
He's up on Twitter constantly, and hang on, let's see if I can find it online. A couple of the tweets that he said.
I have one of them. So he kind of talked about the retelling of the story. This was right after the announcement came out, and talking about how to reflect our current world that we live in, as well as not retelling the same story. And I believe he was going to start with Sheridan.
The press release speaks of Sheridan taking command and having a mysterious past. There's no mention of Sinclair at all in the press release. And Joe says that he did write the press release part of the blurb describing the show. So far, that's the only character we have named. But one thing that he posted that I thought was particularly telling, let me go ahead and read this, it's just a tiny bit long. So we will not be retelling the same story in the same way because of what Heraclitus said about not being able to walk in the same river twice. There would be no fun and no surprises. Better to go the way of Westworld or Battlestar Galactica, where you take the original elements that are evergreen and put them in a blender with a ton of new challenging ideas to create something both fresh and familiar. So what he said a couple of times now is that he wants to do it so that you may think you know where he's going because you've seen the original show. But the idea is that he's going to, he's all about process and the journey, and so you may not know where he's going to go. So I'm excited, but I know a lot of people seem to be a little bit worried about this. Joe is so much better a writer than he was 25 years ago. I don't think that's blasphemy. He really has. He's grown. He works at his craft. So this should be exciting. This should be real exciting. And I don't know how many of you know of or are on his Patreon. He's made it a point of saying, and this isn't a super plug, but he has made a point of saying that as news comes out, his Patreons will get at least a little tiny bit of a heads up. In the latest instance with a new project, a pilot project, not Babylon 5, I think it was about 12 hours, but he still gave us a heads up. don't have a clue.
The question was, will it be the same plot points? And we don't really know that yet, but it'll probably be kind of like the novels with, that he said, broad strokes
Yes.
of the universe, you know.
I would think that, you know, and this is just my guess, the original Babylon 5, he said many times, is about choices and consequences and the results of those choices and consequences. That to me would be one of the evergreen points. Also, the ability of one person to make a difference in the galaxy. I'm sure the rest of you could come up with many other ones, but those are the two that come to my mind right away.
You are behind me. You are in front of me.
He's
They are
somewhere
behind me.
else.
He's somewhere else. But along with that, along with the plot points, there is a big thing kind of staring Joe in the face this time, and that's basically fandom 1.0 versus 2.0 is what I'm kind of calling it. So on the left is what Genie looked like back in the day. It all text, and on the right was CompuServe back in Windows 3. So he's already having some, I don't want to say issues with story ideas being plugged on Twitter. And so we don't know how that is going to play out. Back in the day, we had the, I don't know, I call it RASC V5 moderated, is the short term. Records SFPV V5 moderated, which was a kind of a curated place for Joe to go and ask or answer questions that were not story ideas. But here, people are so used to just throwing things out today on Twitter, even on Facebook. He has his own Facebook page there, and so we don't quite know if he would turn that off and go straight to Patreon or not. I'm worried a little bit that if there was a story idea, because everybody knows the story about the no, I don't even know it. Passing through Gethsemane.
Passing through Gethsemane, there was an issue where a fan asked him what would happen if somebody who had been mind wiped remembered what they had been before. And Joe at the time was working on Passing Through Gethsemane. And so they actually postponed that episode until they could get the fan to sign a release. And I don't know how many of you may have gotten the script books that were put out by B5 Books, but the release is literally a scrap of paper with a handwritten, I release any claim to this story idea.
Yeah. So that's just something that he's playing with, and that's what has me kind of wondering, because he is very prolific on Twitter. But
he is, and
to turn that off would be...
people keep asking him. He actually, for the first time in 30 years, has put together an FAQ list because people keep asking him about when are the Blu-rays coming out. He has no way of, he has no influence on that. But they also keep saying, well, are you going to have this element? And are you going to have this element? And he keeps having to say, don't do that. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, he likes being freely available to the fans, but at one time back on Usenet, he did have to pull back until they came up with the moderated group. What he may end up having to do, I don't think it's possible on Twitter, but he might be able to make a Facebook page where it could be moderated before he saw it.
Yeah.
I don't know, that's way above our pay level, because we don't get paid.
What?
Oh, did I tell you that? But, I don't know, people are asking, you know, is it going to have this or that, and we don't know.
So, how can we help it get into the fall season? You've got the pilot that's coming out. Is it gonna be dependent upon, your numbers? Is it just gonna be an executive decision by the board that gets green lit?
From what Joe is saying so far, it's going to be greenlit based on the script he's written. So,
It's out of our hands.
it's what?
It's
Out
out
of
of
your
our
hands.
hands.
Basically, as far as I know, unless they change their mind and do decide to televise the pilot and wait for ratings. But I think we all know that that changed a long time ago.
Yeah.
They just don't do that anymore. If you see a pilot during, you know, the off-season, chances are you're never gonna see a series. So,
I actually had an idea for a streaming channel called the Pilot Channel. And I thought that would be really cool, like to see all the stuff that nobody's ever seen. But the fees and the restrictions on that are probably,
that would be
Really
horrendous.
bad.
I do remember seeing a few pilots
Yeah.
here at Comic-Con that I would have loved seeing the series of, but that never happened.
we've seen a few, Sean. But, yeah, and this is just an example that I put out. This is the website as I did it in 1995, and this would not fly today at all.
Remember that?
Yeah. I thought it was pretty cool because the image changed every time you reloaded the screen. Yeah.
Wow.
And then here are some other resources that we kind of talked about. His Patreon, which we'll probably need to keep a really close eye on here.
Yeah, and none of the news that he's shared on Patreon is anything that won't become public. It's just that he gives his patrons first crack at it. You know, but he's also concentrating on doing a lot of writing advice on Patreon. One really fun thing that does eventually also get put out to the world is he's been doing new commentaries on the episodes. I think,
I haven't seen them yet, but
yeah, I think 2 or 3 of them have come out to the regular YouTube channel.
yeah, so he releases them on Patreon first
And then eventually he puts them out
YouTube.
into the wild for everybody.
So that's pretty fun.
They're fun.
And then his Twitter, on Facebook, and then he's not actually D5 News on Twitter, that's just someone that we kind of know that puts out, Yakov, that puts out a lot of D5 News out there, so. But, and coming back real quick, I'm known for saying, oh, I'll talk about that later, and never going back to that again. David, the person that was posting things from Genie to Quantum Link over 1200 baud modem back in the day. He actually stayed with Babylon 5, and he coined the term Quantium 40, and he is David the waiter that got credited in the show.
Oh, I knew that a fan had met.
Yeah,
had-
and
had
he
met
named his
Quantum.
daughter Mira.
I
So
may
he
have
is-
met her here a few years ago.
Quite possibly, so, yeah. So, there's a lot of old timers still up there, so. And then again, V5 Books, we have, several titles still available, and the encyclopedia is still on Amazon.
And, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you.
We have a mic